The bishop had been speaking for 9 minutes when the Duke of Northmere leaned toward his bride and said, in a voice pitched for her ear alone, "I expect obedience in all things. You will find it simpler." 300 guests filled the pews of St. Bartholomew's. The June light fell through the east windows in broad, pale columns, catching the dust motes that drifted above the congregation like a second silent audience. The altar flowers, white roses and myrtle, as was proper, had been arranged since dawn by the Northmere gardener, who had been told twice that morning that they must be perfect. Everything must be perfect. The Duke of Northmere had said so, and when the Duke of Northmere said a thing, the world around him rearranged itself accordingly. Emmeline Bryce heard him clearly. She did not turn her head. She was aware of the bishop's voice continuing above them, something about the duties of Christian marriage, the sacred bond, and she was aware of the weight of the ivory muslin gown she wore, which had been made in 9 days by a seamstress in Bath, who had wept with gratitude for the commission. She was aware of her father in the third pew, his hands folded over his prayer book, his expression carefully composed into something he hoped resembled happiness. Reverend Matthias Bryce had agreed to this marriage because the living at Fulwood was ending, and the bishop's fund would not stretch to cover a clergyman with 3 daughters and no connections worth mentioning. He had agreed because Emmeline herself had told him she understood what was being offered and what was being asked, and that she could bear it. She had meant it. She had walked into this church with clear eyes and steady hands and the full understanding that she was exchanging her freedom for her family's survival, and she had considered that a fair transaction because Emmeline Bryce had never had the luxury of considering any transaction unfair simply because it cost her something. But she had not agreed to disappear. 3 seconds passed. She counted them by the rhythm of her own breathing. Then she turned, not to the Duke, but to the bishop, and said, with a composure so absolute that 3 women in the front pews would later describe it as terrifying, "I do not." Bishop Ogilvy stopped speaking. His mouth remained open for a full second afterward, a detail that would be reported in at least 4 drawing rooms before nightfall. He was 63 years old. He had performed over 2,000 marriage ceremonies in his 41 years of ministry, and in not one of them had a bride turned to him mid-ceremony and contradicted a statement that had not technically been addressed to her. He looked at Emmeline. He looked at the Duke. He looked back at Emmeline, as though hoping she might clarify that she had been speaking to someone else. "I beg your pardon," Bishop Ogilvy said. "I do not," Emmeline repeated, in precisely the same tone. "Expect to offer obedience in all things or find it simpler." The silence that followed was unlike any silence Emmeline had experienced. It was not the silence of an empty room or a country lane at dusk. It was the silence of 300 people holding their breath at once, and it had a weight to it, a physical density that pressed against her chest and her temples and the thin skin of her wrists where her pulse beat with remarkable steadiness. The Duke of Northmere did not move. He stood precisely where he had stood for the previous 9 minutes. Tall, immaculate in a dark blue tailcoat with ivory silk waistcoat, his jaw set in the expression of a man who has never been publicly contradicted and cannot quite locate the mechanism by which one responds to it. His hands, which had been clasped loosely behind his back, shifted. That was all. A small motion. But Emmeline noticed, because Emmeline noticed everything, and she filed it alongside the 16 other observations she had made about Lucian Hale in the 4 occasions she had been in his company before this morning. He was not cruel. That was the first thing she had determined at their second meeting, when he had spoken to a footman who spilled wine and had been curt but not vicious. He was not stupid. That was the second thing, established during a dinner at which he had discussed the drainage reforms in the northern counties with more precision than any man present. He was not unkind. That was the third thing, noted when he had noticed her father's discomfort with the richness of the food at his table, and had quietly instructed a servant to bring a simpler plate. But he had spent 34 years being obeyed by servants, obeyed by tenants, obeyed by members of Parliament who sought his influence in the House of Lords, obeyed by his mother, obeyed by the succession of women who had been presented to him as potential brides over the past 6 seasons. He had been obeyed so completely and for so long that he had come to regard obedience not as a thing given, but as a natural condition, like gravity, something that simply existed in his presence. Emmeline Bryce was not gravity. She was a clergyman's daughter from Fulwood with ink stains on her fingers and a thorough education in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and the particular resilience required of a woman who has been overlooked so consistently that she has had ample time to develop opinions. Bishop Ogilvy cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said, with the careful diplomacy of a man who had navigated church politics for 4 decades, "we might pause the ceremony briefly." "Yes," Emmeline said, "I think that would be wise." The Duke said nothing. He turned and walked toward the vestry, and his stride was controlled but rapid, and the sound of his boots on the stone floor rang through the nave with a sharpness that made Lady Saxby, in the 4th pew, press her gloved hand to her mouth. Emmeline followed him. She did not rush. She walked at her own pace, her hands folded in front of her, and she was aware of every eye in the church fixed upon her back, and she did not alter her posture by a single degree. Reverend Bryce half rose from his seat as she passed, his face drained of all color, and she gave him the smallest nod, a nod that said, "I know what I am doing, and please sit down." And he sat because his eldest daughter had been gently commanding him since she was 11 years old, and he had long since stopped pretending he could resist it. The vestry door closed behind them. It was a small room. Dark oak paneling, a writing desk stacked with parish registers, a crucifix on the wall, and a window of plain glass that looked out onto the churchyard, where the June sun fell across the gravestones with the particular indifference of weather to human catastrophe. The Duke stood at the window with his back to her, and his shoulders were rigid, and his breathing was audible. "You have humiliated me," he said, "in front of every family of consequence in 3 counties." "Yes," Emmeline said. She sat down in the chair beside the writing desk, because her legs were shaking, and she would rather he did not see it, and because sitting while he stood shifted the geometry of the room in a way she preferred. "Would you like me to explain why, or would you prefer to be angry first?" He turned. His expression was not what she expected. She had expected fury, the clean, uncomplicated fury of a man whose authority has been challenged. What she saw instead was fury, and something else beneath it, something unsettled, something almost curious, and she understood in that moment that Lucian Hale had not been surprised by anyone in a very long time, and did not entirely know what to do with the sensation. "I would prefer," he said, each word placed with deliberate care, "an explanation for why my bride has just refused to marry me in front of 300 witnesses." "I have not refused to marry you." He stared at her. "You said, and I recall this clearly, madam, as it occurred approximately 90 seconds ago, I do not. I said I do not expect to offer obedience in all things. I did not say I would not marry you. Those are different statements." She folded her hands in her lap. "I came to this church prepared to be your wife. I came prepared to manage your household, to represent your name in society, to bear your children, and to conduct myself with the dignity your position requires. I did not come prepared to be your servant. If you wished for a servant, you might have saved yourself a ceremony and hired one. They are considerably less expensive." The silence that followed was 3 full breaths long. "You are a clergyman's daughter," he said. "Your family has nothing. Your father's living ends at Michaelmas. Your sisters have no prospects. You came to this altar because you had no other option, and you presumed to dictate terms." "I came to this altar because I had no other option," she agreed. "That does not mean I came without conditions. It means I was unable to state them earlier, because you never asked." She met his gaze. "You arranged this marriage through my father. You discussed settlements with your solicitor. You informed me of the date by letter. At no point, Your Grace, did you inquire what I might require from this arrangement. You assumed I would require nothing, because you have spent your life surrounded by people who require nothing from you except the privilege of your attention." He opened his mouth, closed it. "I am not ungrateful," Emmeline continued, and her voice was steady and clear and carried no anger whatsoever, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing about it. "You are offering my family security. I understand the value of that, and I would not have agreed if I did not. But you whispered to me at the altar, Your Grace, where I stood in a church before God and your guests, that you expected obedience. And I decided in that moment that if I allowed that statement to pass unchallenged, every day of this marriage would be built on its foundation, and I would spend the rest of my life living inside a sentence I should have interrupted." Lucian Hale looked at her for a long time. The June light from the vestry window caught the side of his face, and she could see the fine tension in his jaw and the way his hands held at his sides opened and closed once. "What do you want?" he said. "I want a marriage, not an arrangement." "There's no difference." "There is every difference." She did not raise her voice. "An arrangement requires one party to be silent. A marriage requires both parties to speak. I am willing to be your wife, Your Grace. I am not willing to be your silence." He crossed the room, not toward her, toward the writing desk, where he placed both hands flat on the surface and stood with his head bowed for several seconds. She could see the tendons in the backs of his hands. She could hear his breathing settle from rapid to controlled, and she recognized the shift because she had performed the same negotiation with her own body every day of her life. "My mother chose you," he said without looking up, "because she said you were sensible." "I am sensible." Sensible women do not stop their own weddings. Sensible women stop them before the wrong vows are made. Correcting an error after it is sworn before God is considerably more difficult than correcting one before. He lifted his head. Something had changed in his expression. The fury was still there, but it had thinned, and beneath it she saw the thing she had noticed once before, at the dinner when he had spoken about drainage reforms, the quick, restless intelligence of a man who had been given very few opportunities to use it against an equal. "You realize," he said, "that if we do not return to that church, this marriage does not happen. Your father loses everything. Your sisters lose everything." "Yes." "And you are still sitting there?" "Yes." He straightened. He pulled the chair from the opposite side of the desk, sat down facing her, and for the first time since she had met him, looked at her not as a transaction, but as a person. "Tell me your conditions," he said. She told him. She spoke for 4 minutes without interruption, and she had clearly thought about every word before this day, because the conditions arrived in order, precisely stated, without repetition or excess. She wanted her own rooms, not banishment, but privacy. She wanted access to the library and permission to continue her studies. She wanted her father's living replaced, not with charity, but with a proper benefice arranged through the bishop's office so that Matthias Bryce might keep his dignity. She wanted her sisters provided for, modestly, not lavishly, with small dowries that would allow them choices. She wanted a voice in the management of the household. She wanted, when they appeared in public together, to be introduced as his wife and not his acquisition. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he sat in silence for a full minute, and she let the silence hold, because she understood that he was not deciding whether to agree. He was deciding what it meant that he wanted to. "The benefice," he said finally. "I will write to the bishop this week." "Thank you." "Your sisters, dowries of 400 pounds each." 300 will do. We are not greedy." He looked at her sharply, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was certainly not displeasure. 300 then. The library is yours whenever you wish. The household. We will discuss that after you have seen the house. I will not promise what I do not yet know you will want. That is fair. And when we appear in public, he said, and his voice had changed, quieter now, stripped of the formal distance he had maintained since their first meeting. You will be introduced as my wife, because that is what you will be. She stood. He stood. They regarded each other across the writing desk in the vestry of St. Bartholomew's, and the distance between them was 3 feet, and the distance between what this marriage had been 30 minutes ago and what it was now could not be measured in any unit she knew.